Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Secure Developer. I'm really excited today. For those of you who don't know, we're an inclusive community that aims to educate and enable developers in application security. I am joined by Sam Newman today, and he'll be talking about insecure transit microservice security. But before we get started on that, I quickly wanted to introduce myself. So my name is Sam Hepburn, and I'm the community manager here, and I work behind the scenes to hopefully make all of this happen. I'm also joined by my colleague, Brian, who will be helping to facilitate questions today. So say hi, Brian.
Hi, here I am again. If you have questions, please put them up in the Slack channel. We've got this live session channel. Please put them up there and we will feed them back to Sam at an appropriate time so he can just focus on his presentation. Feel free to ask anything and feel free to comment on any questions that are already there. Just use it.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for the help today. So as Brian said, Slack is the best way to interact with our speaker today. So if you haven't joined the Slack, you can either jump onto thesecuredeveloper.com, or if you're already on the site, at the bottom of the live streaming screen, you'll see the link there. And then, as you said, join the live sessions channel, and you can ask all your questions in there. We also love feedback. So if you like today's session or you want to see any future sessions, jump on the Slack or the Twitter or the website and let us know. The other thing to mention is the best way is if you go to the settings cog on the bottom right-hand corner and turn your resolution to max, that's the best way to view today's session. The Secure Developer is brought to you by Sneak. The aim is to create a vendor-neutral space to share knowledge and best practices related to software security. So thanks to them. But that is enough for me. Without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Sam to get going with sessions. Sam, over to you.
Thanks so much. Well, good morning, no, good afternoon, everybody. It's the afternoon here. It's sort of the evening here, I'll be honest with you, but I know it's different times all over the world. But thank you very much for coming along today to I guess listen to me rant on about microservice security. So we'll get started. So we'll be doing questions at the end, but please ask questions as we go. I'm just get my screen sharing working. This is always the fun moment when you realise that the screen sharing want to work. So I'm just going to hope that the screen sharing is coming up okay. So yeah, this talk's called Insecure Transit, and it's really all about microservice security aspects associated with it. And we're going to be talking specifically about some microservice aspects around transport security, which is part of the title, but also some more fundamental basics of application security that can become a bit more challenging in a microservice environment. Just a bit of background. My name is Sam Newman. I wrote a book on microservices a few years ago. I'm currently in the process of writing a new book called Monolithic Microservices, which an early access of that is already available. I also run my own consultancy, so I do training, advisory, and consultants, and sort of advisory work really on microservices, continuous delivery, those sorts of things. I think it's pretty worth reflecting on the fact that I am not a security expert. I'm what I describe as a conscious incompetent. I'm somebody who knows that I don't know much, and I'm trying to educate myself. I come at this very much from the point of view of a developer trying to learn more about these things. If you want to know more about any of the work that I do in my day job, feel free to go over to my website, which is fairly easy to find on the internet. The reason I became sort of interested in application security was sort of twofold. The first hand, I was looking at these architectures, these microservice architectures, trying to think about different ways of building systems, different ways of helping people ship software effectively. And those architectures were causing more challenges in the face of application security concerns, and also creating opportunities too, to be fair. But this is also sort of happening at the same time that we're all becoming a bit more aware of the impact of things like data breaches. We've probably many of you may be familiar with things like the large Equifax breach, where almost 150 million Americans had their information effectively compromised, a credit scoring agency. We've got bugs and defects and issues now that occur not just in our software and our application dependencies, but also actually in the underlying chipsets of our software. We're now getting patches for our computer chips. We're getting patches for our motherboards now. With things like Meltdown and Spectre, those sort of concerns came to the floor, and so this sort of it becomes quite interesting now, because we've sort of got this world where we think in terms of delivery focus of the sort of design, develop, test, ship loop in a way, right? We're thinking about trying to bring design thinking into how we ship software. We're doing testing as part of our delivery, our development cycle. We're trying to think about shipping our software as frequently as possible and bringing more operations type work into the work done by our teams. But increasingly, we sort of, and this is great, because increasingly we're sort of trying to think of our software delivery cycle holistically, but we sort of still treat a little bit security like it's off to one side. Like, well, security is too hard for me to do, I'm just going to have to get in some special experts who really understand security, because I just don't. But this is where we are, I think, now, where security is maybe where we were, say, 10 or 15 years ago, when it came to thinking about things like application testing. We used to not test our own code as developers. We used to abdicate responsibility to other people. We would have a team of testers test our systems for us. In the same way as nowadays, I think we sort of, well, many of us anyway, say, okay, security is not really my concern. And I think that's not the case. I think you may still want experts who understand the field of security really well, but there's a lot to be said for you doing and knowing just enough security. And that's kind of where I come at this. I'm trying to share what I think is enough security concerns for you to think about. And you might need help implementing some of these ideas from experts who do know these areas really, really well. But for a lot of the stuff I'm going to share, I don't think you do. I think, and actually for a lot of the stuff I'm going to share, this is the kind of thinking you need to build into how you think about developing your systems and developing your architecture. When it comes to microservices, we kind of have this interesting challenge regarding security, because we always draw them as these nice sort of isolated deployable units, these separate processes typically, or maybe even functions if you're going all serverless on us, which immediately creates some interesting opportunities when it comes to thinking about security of our system processing, security of our data. Because unlike, say, a monolithic system where all of our data is stored in one place, we sort of where we have that sort of that fundamental issue, which is, if our monolithic system is breached, if someone gets hold of our monolithic database, they've got access to all of our data. An exploit that works against our process, our single monolithic process system, sort of cracks open the whole system, and everything becomes available to a malicious party. Likewise, one innocent mistake could open up everything. With a microservice architecture, we have that the option to more isolate our different processing, and the option to isolate our data. In fact, when I talk about microservice architecture, I typically talk about the fact that microservices own their own data. We don't have a monolithic schema. We break data storage down into its constituent parts. And so microservices own their own data. What that means is that those concerns about data being breached or data being accessed, we've got more isolation around those things. This can be quite useful, actually, if you think about things like the GDPR. With the GDPR, one of your main concerns is, where is personally identifiable information? Now, some people would argue, well, if I have a monolithic schema and all my data's there, I know it's all there. But with a microservice architecture, you might have 10, 15, 20 databases, but you might be able to say, actually, I know personally identifiable information only hits 3 of those databases. And so immediately you limit the scope of the system that you have to worry about when it comes to thinking about auditing and compliance across a whole host of issues. Likewise, having multiple services gives you the opportunity for sort of increased defense in depth. You have multiple perimeters at which to defend your system, placing in monitoring applications, putting in sort of different application firewalls. Maybe you could do things around, say, network peering relationships and sort of virtualized software-defined networks to isolate units of compute and everything else. Whereas with a monolithic system, you sort of have that single perimeter issue. You have more reduced places at where you can protect and defend your application. And so on the one hand, microservice architecture, because of this this property of isolation between those running processes, because of this property of isolation in terms of data storage, we could think about building applications which are more resilient to attack from a malicious party, and where also a breach may have limited impact or more limited impact than a monolithic system. And that's true in a way, James Lewis is sort of fond of saying that microservice architectures buy you options. Microservice architectures come with a degree of complexity, but in exchange for that complexity, you get some great options in terms of how to, in this example, solve your security concerns in different ways. But there is additional complexity. You don't get that for free. Microservices give you the opportunity to build more secure software, but out of the box, they may actually create more problems in the area of security, because fundamentally, there are more processes that are running. Those processes are communicating with each other over networks. Information that used to flow within a single process system is now flowing over networks. We start having to think about network security. You also have effectively a larger attack surface area. We have more processes running. And a weak spot, a weak process somewhere, an unpatched vulnerability that you've forgotten about, or could open up an opportunity for an external party to gain access to your system. And so you have more places at which your application needs to be defended and protected and patched and everything else. So there is a sort of yin and yang type thing when it comes to application security and microservices. And sort of my bottom line with this has always been, if you're smart and savvy, I think you can build more secure applications using microservices, but it doesn't come for free. And I think a team which is more naive or less experienced when it comes to thinking about application security is likely going to end up with an application architecture which has more issues in the security space. And that's partly what I'm going to try and help offset here. I'm going to give you sort of what are just enough security things that you need to think about for a microservice architecture point of view. We're going to go through some simple stuff. We'll go into some more advanced stuff towards the end of the talk. But we are going to start with some basics. And I think I'm sort of, I actually think as human beings, we're not fantastic actually at assessing risk. I think when it comes to security, certainly when it comes to things like application security of microservice architectures, people immediately want to start talking about JOT tokens, confused deputy problems, secret stores, and all these sorts of things. And the reality is that's not always the place to start. There's actually loads of good data out there talking about what kind of mechanisms do people use to attack systems. And one such study, which I quite like, is the Verizon Data Breach Report. The Verizon Data Breach Report is put out every year. This is actually taken from the 2017 edition, so I haven't updated this for the 2019 version isn't out yet. The 2018 is. I haven't updated it for that slide. And this was actually an analysis looking at Verizon's customers, and they found that something like 81% of all the data breaches they looked at, what sort of one of the attack vectors used by the malicious parties was basically passwords being hacked and or stolen. So a mix of social engineering, easy to guess passwords, stuff like that. So the vast majority of their data breaches, gaining access to stolen credentials or hacking weak credentials, was a big part of how those external parties gained access to these systems. And this is actually quite depressing in a way, but also a good thing, because actually doing better at passwords is something that everyone can do. But a lot of people don't actually know what the good advice is for passwords. And some of the advice from security experts, it can be a little bit contradictory for some. If you don't know a bit more about how to think about managing passwords in a proper, secure way, Troy Hunt's got an excellent post on this subject, and he's basically summarizing a lot of the information that comes out of NIST in the US and the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. And there's loads of great tips sort of that come out of both of those government agencies' recommendations. And Troy does a very good job of sort of summarizing some of them. I'm going to run through a few of them because I think some of these are quite interesting. Some of the stuff in here is quite basic, right? Which is longer is stronger. Having a long password is better than having a short password. Longer passwords create more entropy and are therefore harder for somebody to hack. The next thing that gets interesting is this, that we should eliminate complex character composition rules. Now, this actually, for some people, is quite surprising, but we've all been sort of stumped by really annoying, complicated rules about coming up with the passwords. Now, the argument around having complex character composition rules is it's one way of increasing the entropy of the password. But what it ends up doing when they're this complicated is people end up coming up with mnemonics that make these passwords very easy to guess and therefore much more prone to things like dictionary hack attacks. For example, you might say you've got to use a capital letter, you've got to use symbols, you've got to use numbers, and someone does capital P at symbol 55W0RD, which is in every dictionary file used in hacks, breach attacks out there. So when you have a complex character composition rules as your way of generating entropy, you end up with people picking passwords which are very easy to actually be hacked. And actually, if you just let people use normal text but allow them to do longer passwords, you'd probably get the entropy you needed. Another obvious thing is embrace password managers. You should make it easy for your users to use password managers. There are still some very kind of highly visible public-facing websites and sign-up systems which still do not allow pasting of passwords, which effectively stops password managers being used, and that's really unforgivable in this day and age. But you should be using password managers yourself and using unique passwords for every single service you use, for your personal stuff and your work stuff as well. And I would suggest having separate password vaults for your company and personal use. This is a really interesting one. Do not mandate password changes for your users. The reason for this is because this is a great way of training your customers for phishing attacks. If you're constantly bombarding them with requests to change their password, and you'll say doing it every 3 months or every 6 months, then what happens is people just get bored. Oh, I've got another password change. Oh, I've got another password change. Oh, I've got another password change. And before you realize it, actually they're filling in their password information into fake pages that have been sent to them. So actually you're training people to be more susceptible to social engineering if you mandate password changes. It is much, much more sensible to block previously breached passwords. And there are systems out there like Have I Been Pwned, which contain databases of known breached passwords. And so it's very easy now actually to automate the process of identifying when these passwords may have been breached and telling people to upgrade or change those passwords. And that's something that happens to me in a few sites. Now I get emails saying, we think this password may have been breached, could you please change it? And I'd much prefer that approach than always mandating that I change those things. And that goes for some of your internal credentials as well. Some of you, as an example of what can go wrong, some of you, I suspect actually probably none of you have ever heard of this company, Codespaces. Codespaces are a company that provided secure source code hosting. They built and ran their system on Amazon, on AWS. And so just to sort of be really clear, they provided secure source code hosting as a service, and somebody got hold of the root Amazon credentials, so the root login account. I don't think they ever found out if this was an ex-employee or just someone who just sort of hacked the credentials or whatever. But they used that and deleted the entire public production system for Codespaces. Unfortunately, all of the backups for this site were also on the same Amazon account, as was all the source code for the system, so nothing could be rebuilt. Basically, that wiped the whole company out in the space of about 5 minutes. There's a couple of things in here. Firstly, don't leave your root Amazon credentials lying around. Secondly, you can limit the scope of these credentials. So if you had a separate account for your development purposes versus production, have a separate account for your backups. Even if someone does get hold of your root Amazon credentials, there's limits to what they can do. Actually, this is a common problem where people will have API keys that they might have for programmatic access to cloud services. They're often in configuration files because people are using those as part of automated processes they're running from their laptops. The problem is then people can sometimes accidentally check these API credentials in. There is software actually that you can use to scan sort of Git repos looking for what look like API credentials that have been checked in. So GitRob is something I've used inside organizations before to do this. I know that Amazon themselves certainly also scan public-facing Git repos looking for things that look like Amazon API keys and alerting the owners. So just be aware of that. One of the ways you limit the impact of things like Amazon API credentials falling into the wrong hands is effectively building a system where those things are rotated on a regular basis. This is a bit different from your human being passwords. You're thinking here more about your programmatic credentials, things used by other programs. So think about your Amazon API keys, which a lot of organizations now have a system whereby when you get, you actually have to request an Amazon API key and that's only valid for a short period of time, maybe half an hour. So you can do that with, say, directory federation. The idea being, if you leave those API keys and they get checked in and they get found by somebody else, they've already been revoked, because they're getting revoked constantly on maybe a 30-minute or 45-minute basis. And that's a great idea for these sort of more programmatic credentials. But it also becomes a kind of a bit of a puzzle when we start thinking about microservice architectures, because there are actually lots of credentials that we want our running services to have access to. So the question is, well, how do they get their secret, well, effectively their secrets, and how do we handle revocation or rotation of those credentials? Because these shared secrets could be things like API keys. These could be keys for validating JOT tokens. You could even be thinking of things like, your client-side certificate management, but even something as basic actually as credentials for accessing databases. Here my shipping service needs to talk to its database. To do that, it's going to need some authorization credentials. It's going to need a username and password. And normally we'll provide these username and password by putting them into a text file that is available to the running shipping process. The shipping process reads that information out as probably certainly a runtime, and then can use that to access the database to get its data. Of course, if that text file is left lying around, people can get hold of those credentials, which could be a problem. And so we've got a couple of issues. It's like, well, I've got these text files now, but now I've got lots and lots of text files. And these text files, there's this other thing with microservice architectures, which is that quite often you build a microservice and it just works and it doesn't need to be changed for 6 months or a year. So how do you handle revoking credentials of a service which is just out there and running? Do you have to now redeploy the service to redeploy the configuration? Do you have to come up with some kind of centralized management system for your configuration values so you can update these values? But then how does that work when we've got things like secrets that you don't really want in plain text? This is where tools, secret stores, come into play, and they can be really useful for microservice architectures because they can help solve the problem of distributing secrets to large number of processes, but also handling revocation or rotation of those credentials on a sort of an ongoing basis. All the cloud, so the big cloud vendors have some support for this. You've got things like AWS Key Management Service and Parameter Store and those sorts of things on AWS, for example. I'm a big fan of Vault from HashiCorp. So this is a really powerful tool. It does many, many different things, but I'm going to focus on kind of its core use in a way. And this is something that you are free to deploy. Something you deploy yourself. It works really well on systems that run on top of Kubernetes. It works really well on systems that don't use Kubernetes. You can it's like a dedicated open source secret store you can deploy and run on your system. It's a really, really interesting, powerful tool. One of the things it does that's really smart is it's able to issue time limited credentials. It supports different backends. So your application can go and say, can I have the username and password for my database? And Vault can actually speak, for example, here to Postgres on your behalf and generate on the fly a username and database credential just for that application, and specifically just for that instance of that application. And so you're limiting who has access to those credentials, and it'll also handle automatic revocation of those. So Vault has support for different kinds of backends, and of course Vault can do that just as well for human beings as anything else. And so I've used Vault for issuing time-limited Amazon API keys as an alternative to something like Active Directory Federation. So that's nice. And if the application wants to speak directly to Vault, and you can certainly have your application be programmed to talk to Vault directly via its API. But that means your application sort of has to be changed to talk to Vault, and that's about a bunch of work. And that's actually where a sort of related project comes in. That's a project called Console Template. What Console Template does is it allows you to update the content of text files based on what's either in Console, which is HashiCorp, so it's a discovery tool, and also in Vault. So what this means is you can have a configuration file. So here's an example of a configuration file where I'm specifying where my Postgres instance is. And what Vault will do is it can dynamically update that text file for me as the values in my secret store change. So my running application doesn't now need to know about Vault. It just needs to know about where is that text file and be able to reread that text file when it changes. And that's really lovely now, because I've got all this stuff. If I can read from a configuration file, and if I can install Vault, I can now have Vault dynamically change those credentials, revoke those credentials as needed. As long as my application can reread those text files, I'm good to go. Let's look at some other sort of things I've put in the basic but difficult with microservices world, and that's things like patching. So here's another study from 2016. We're going a bit further back here. This is a study done by Forbes and BMC that found in 44% of all security breaches they looked at, basically the vulnerabilities that were sort of used as part of that breach, those vulnerabilities were already known and fixes were already available for them. In other words, you saw a problem like somebody's leaving the back door open. Rather than closing that back door, you carry on. Then someone gets in through the back door and steals your stuff. And it's like, well, if we closed the back door earlier, this wouldn't have happened. As a really great recent example of this kind of phenomenon, we can come back to Equifax. So Equifax is a very serious breach because Equifax fundamentally is a credit scoring agency. So they have to have a lot of information about their customers in order to assess their credit worthiness. When that data there was therefore breached, there was lots of very valuable information in there. We're talking about things like, we're not just talking about basic things that we already know people have stolen about us, like, our email addresses and our date of birth. We're talking social security numbers here, bank details, all the addresses you've lived in, all this is huge amounts of information. And that you don't get that back, right? So this is a big, serious deal. Now, it turned out in this particular situation that there was a vulnerability in a web application library that the Equifax team were using. So they were using a web application, a Java web app framework called Struts. And a vulnerability was detected in Struts. Here's the CVE entry for it. And you can see here that when you go to the CVE database, you can see they have like these little impact scores as the CVSS severity score. And we can see that this particular vulnerability in Struts has a base score of 10. So 10 is critical. Now, the key thing to understand here is that this score of 10 is not out of 100 or out of 1,000. It's out of 10. And 10 is not the good end of the scale. So this is about as bad as it could possibly be, this vulnerability. So that's not good. The vulnerability was actually reported to people in March 2017. So basically, researchers found this vulnerability and reported this vulnerability to, and basically sort of reported it publicly at the same time that patches were made available. This is quite a common practice when you have major vulnerabilities like this, because basically behind the scenes, what's happening is someone's found this defect, they've gone and spoken to the people who maintain this software, said, look, this is really bad, let's get some patches out so people can fix this problem. And then to make sure people do actually apply the patches, they report information about the bug as well, so you have a real reason to do the upgrades. So it's a very common pattern, this. So the bugs was announced, this massively nasty bug, at the same time as the patches were available. That's good stuff. That's really, really good stuff, actually. So 7th of March, these patches are available. Now let's talk about what we know about Equifax. So we know that the breach, when all of this data was stolen, this happened sometime between mid-May and July of that year, of 2017 this was. Equifax are not quite sure when it happened in that window, but it's somewhere in that window. Now they spotted this problem in July 29th. Okay, so if it happened in mid-May, that's quite a long time until they noticed it, which is not great. What's also not great is that although they spotted it internally, this breach, on the 29th of July, they didn't actually report it until September the 7th, which is, as you can see, a massive gap. It's interesting that there are no mandatory data breach reporting requirements in the US. There are now in the EU. I believe it's part of the GDPR. And I'm a big fan of mandatory. If you lose your customers' data, you have to tell them, right? The fact that this is not an option, that you have the option not to tell them, that's pretty unforgivable. There's also something else interesting between these 2 days, between July 29th and September the 7th. Some Equifax executives did offload some of their stock, which I know has got the interest of the Securities and Exchange Commission as well, because there's potential insider trading concerns there, of course. So we know that by the time they discovered the breach, the patch had been available for at least 2 months. So if the breach had happened in mid-May, they had at least a 2-month window before they could have updated that and fixed that. But it could have been as long as 4 months. They could have had up to 4 months to apply that patch to stop this problem stone dead. So 2 to 4 months. So I'd be kind of, I can't see you all, unfortunately, all over the world, but let me ask a question a bit. How many of you are confident that you patch all of your systems every two to 4 months? That within a 2 to 4 month window, all of the software you run on has applied all of its patches and is up to date with the latest known vulnerability fixes. And I think often I get other people saying, yes, I'm actually pretty confident about that. But when you start diving a bit deeper into microservice security stacks, so if you think about the common deployment stack for a microservice architecture, it's a little bit of a complex affair. There's lots of layers and layers and layers and things nesting going on. You know, we think about, we've got our underlying hardware. On top of our underlying hardware, we have our operating systems. On top of our operating systems, we will run a hypervisor. This is where our virtualization kicks in. The virtualization will maintain separate VMs. At this point, this is sort of what you would have if you were, say, running managed virtual machines on AWS or Azure or Google, or within your own data centers. Of course, virtual machines are very, very 2010. Now everyone's using containers, so we've probably got some container library like Docker. On top of Docker, we've now got a container operating system running inside your container image. On top of your container operating system, you've got your application running on top of there as well. So this is a sort of stack that you would expect to see with a modern sort of microservice application stack running on the containerized platform. With underlying virtualization. And that's normally how these things are done. It's very rare that people run Docker containers straight on bare metal. They normally run inside virtualized machines. So every single layer here needs patching. Every single layer. And we know our hardware needs patching. Remember our Spectre and Meltdown, right? So given that, if this is what your application stack looks like, if this is what your deployment stack looks like, how many people, I wonder, out there are still confident that you're applying those patches every 2 to 4 months? The issue is that there's lots of different layers. Those layers are owned by different people. You don't have visibility into who's doing what, and it's like, it gets confusing. So it's like, well, okay, so how can we solve these problems? Well, the first thing is just go on the cloud, you know, a public cloud, right? Go to Azure, go to Google, go to Amazon, because even just if you think just from a managed virtual machine point of view, the cloud provider is going to handle patching the hardware, the operating system, the hypervisors for you. Done. You do not need to worry about that. And actually, if you're using the VMs they give you, you can also, to an extent, they'll do that for you as well. We know, for example, that when the Spectre and Meltdown bugs patches were made available, that all the cloud vendors had rolled those out within a week. And we could tell that because all of our machines got 30% slower. So offload the requirements. I don't mean to offend any of you, but it's highly likely that the big three public cloud vendors do a significantly better job of managing fleets of virtual machines than you do. They provide their services, they run them at scale, they have a huge amount of expertise looking after these things. And so you just offload a bunch of these concerns. So the nice thing about the public cloud, if you go to a provider and rather than going with managed virtual machines, you're instead going for maybe one of their managed Kubernetes or container platforms options. So you might be going to, say, a managed Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes, ECS. Even more of that deployment stack is being handled for you from a point of view of patching and everything else. And increasingly for people on public cloud platforms, this is the direction they're going in. Kubernetes as one doesn't mean you have to run your own Kubernetes. Of course, that still leaves some of the things under our control. Typically, the container operating system that runs inside your container image and the application that your application is running inside that container image as well, that's still your responsibility to look after. Unless you're maybe picking an even higher level of abstraction. If you're maybe picking, say, a serverless deployment stack, for example, you might just be deploying application code onto a managed runtime, which in turn is running on top of a managed container. So using, say, Azure Cloud Functions, AWS Lambda, again, there's even an even smaller scope of what you have to worry about. But you still have to worry about your application code. And importantly, just as Equifax did, you have to think about vulnerabilities in your third-party library dependencies too. So what are our solutions out there? Well, there are tools out there for scanning for vulnerabilities in containers. Some of you may have heard of things like Claire, which has been around for a while. Claire has some limitations. I've certainly seen issues with it taking quite a long time to run and pick up all the analysis, but it's a good starting point for looking at some vulnerabilities in application containers. But there are more modern, effective solutions out there for container-based vulnerability detection and more active scanning and monitoring in production systems. And I'd be looking at things like Aqua for those sorts of things, because you can take the latest and greatest Ubuntu container operating system to run inside your container image, which is not a lot of people do that anymore because it's quite big, but you pick the latest Alpine, right? And it's got no vulnerabilities, it's brand new, it's been patched, it's updated, and you deploy it. And you deploy it onto a service and you don't touch that service for 6 months. Guess what? That service has not been patched for 6 months. Do you know that? Are you aware of what vulnerabilities might be running inside that sort of system because you haven't touched it for so long? This is where things like Aqua can really help. When it comes to application dependencies, this is where I really, really like SNCC. And SNCC are actually sponsoring this the secure developer work as well. So thanks very much for that. I'm doing this talk for free. I really like SNCC, right? I do it. I do not get paid, right? SNCC does a fantastic job of monitoring your application dependencies, and it will send you an email saying your dependencies have known vulnerabilities in them. Here's a pull request to fix those dependencies so you can get the latest and greatest versions. I also like the fact you can build it into your CI workflows as well, so your builds will fail if you're depending on third-party vulnerabilities and so you can't deploy a new version of your software until you've addressed those issues. Something like this could have saved Equifax an awful lot of money. So for me, it's sort of a SNCC or similar type of tool is a no-brainer. There are alternatives to stick out there. Most of them tend to be quite specific for certain technology stacks. So I've used npm check in the past, for example. That's for very narrowly just looking at sort of Node, and where SNCC has support for lots of different application stacks. So this is sort of table stakes stuff, right? This is just, why wouldn't you have ongoing checking of your patch levels just built into your CI process? That just seems like a really easy, obvious thing to do. We expect live daily feedback of the quality of our software from a functional point of view by running tests on our local machines or in CI when we check in. Why can't we have the same things with things like SNCC and Aqua for our microservice deployments as well? So that's a good thing, right? For our microservice stacks is getting a bit more active monitoring, and also automated and automatable tools in that chain. Both Aqua and SNCC are very easy to integrate into sort of modern developer workflows. I'd also say at this stage that doing some kind of threat modeling is really quite important. I've sort of pointed at more general places where you might want to think about vulnerabilities in your system, passwords, patching, things like that. And that's just because that's just sort of no-brainer stuff you should look at. When people start getting to that next level of, okay, what next do I worry about? It's often important to do some sort of take a step back and think a bit more broadly about the threats that you are most worried about. A threat modeling exercise, using something like the Stride or Dread threat modeling systems would be a really good way of you sort of taking an objective assessment about where your vulnerabilities actually are. Because again, I think as developers, we all too often jump for the shiny stuff rather than actually thinking about, where we're actually most vulnerable. Microsoft actually have some really nice documentation all about its process over the security development lifecycle website. I'm not suggesting you embrace that whole process wholesale. It's still a little bit waterfally, I think, in a way, for my mileage, but there's some great information in here. And there's certainly practices you can pull into your process. And again, actually, this is one area where if you've not done threat modeling before, this might be a good use of an external consultant. Get somebody in to spend a couple of weeks with you, do a threat model for your system. That could be something you don't have to do very often. Maybe you have to do it every couple of years, but just to update your thinking about what you're worried about. Coming out of a threat modeling exercise, you'd expect to see a prioritized list of things that you need to fix as an organization. So I'm going to take some water. Okay. So let's start talking about some of the more sort of tricky issues in microservice application security. And to do that, we're just going to pick up a very simple architecture here as our example system. This is Music Corp, a new version of Music Corp. Some of you may have watched other talks I've done, and I've always used this example of a website that sells CDs online. And you can tell how long I've been using it for because we're selling CDs online. So we're very simple, just exposing 4 services here. This dotted box is our perimeter. We have external clients, native web application, and a mobile application that talk to our system. We also have sort of external dependencies on third parties that we talk to over the public internet. And so some of the first things that people start worrying about is the transport securities, these arrows. As we touched on at the beginning, information that with a monolithic system would flow within a single process is now throwing over networks and is therefore much more open to attack or being viewed or manipulated by external parties. So we start thinking about transport security in a microservice environment. There's kind of 4 things we're looking for, really. Firstly, can people see the data as it flows? Secondly, can they manipulate the data? Thirdly, how can we restrict access to the endpoints in the first place? And lastly, can we stop people pretending to be endpoints and pretending to be services? Typically, people worry sort of more about the top 3, but the 4th one is something that you do need to give some thought to. Although often the things we do, like HTTPS, for example, solve impersonation of endpoints. Talk about that actually. Let's talk about HTTPS everywhere. So. And by HTTPS everywhere, what we mean specifically is the HTTP protocol in conjunction with something like TLS. Even HTTP is a very common, well-supported protocol. It's a very common protocol for people doing synchronous communication between services, and because of the great tool support, it's often a good starting point. Again, some people consider this table stakes for this sort of stuff. What do we get from something like HTTP and TLS? Well, the first thing is we get server guarantees. So when we communicate with a server over HTTPS, if we're validating the certificates, and you should validate your certificates as a client, of course, we get guarantee that the server we're talking to is who the server claims to be. So this stops impersonation of endpoints. We also get guarantees that the payload we receive has not been manipulated, because we're stopping things like man-in-the-middle attacks, assuming we're not terminating the HTTPS along the way. We don't necessarily, though, get any guarantees around the clients. So we're not actually restricting access to endpoints with just normal HTTPS. But certificate management, and the pushback has always been with this sort of stuff is, well, managing certificates is always painful. And this is a really weak excuse nowadays. I mean, for public-facing services, this is really a non-issue with things like Let's Encrypt, which people went really crazy about. Let's Encrypt. Oh, it's great because it's free. And free was never the issue. Free was never the blocker for people running HTTPS, because it wasn't the $25 certificate from Thwaite that was putting you off implementing this stuff, right? It was the fact it was all manual. Let's Encrypt automates this stuff, and that's great. Automation is really important here. All of the cloud providers, again, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, all make it easy for you to generate certificates. In fact, they do that for free for you as well. It's fully automated as part of their software development kits. There's no real excuse for not doing this anymore. So again, this is basic level stuff. Server-side certificates for HTTPS-based communication just makes sense. And this helps us in terms of observation of data. It stops data being manipulated. It doesn't necessarily restrict access to endpoints, but it does stop endpoints being impersonated. So actually, out of the box is something pretty easy for a very commonly used protocol. It's probably just a sensible choice to use everywhere within your perimeter, and also, of course, for all public-facing access as well. Now, you can make this even better by implementing what's called mutual TLS. So mutual TLS is where not only do you have effectively, the server has a certificate that says, yes, I am the server I claim to be, but you also now require that the client has its own certificate as well, so that the client can basically authenticate itself with the server effectively. So you establish effectively a cryptographic degree of trust at this point. So at this point, we have client and server guarantees. Now, again, the pushback here with mutual TLS is that certificate management is painful for client-side certificates as well. And this is not as clear-cut to solve, but again, there are good solutions now for solving certificate management. Again, the public cloud vendors have actually got a really good story here. You have got things like Azure client-side certificate management, for example, where you can do stuff like setting up mutual TLS termination inside the API gateways that Azure have to make your application code much simpler. You can do very similar things with the API gateway on Amazon as well. Again, it's free, it's just configuration work. So on a public cloud vendor, this is a pretty easy stuff to do. If you're running this stuff yourself on your own infrastructure, this might be a bit more complicated, although there are now solutions for people around top of things like Kubernetes. This is where a lot of people would use a service mesh like Istio. If we have time, we'll come back and talk about service meshes as well. So mutual TLS, observation of data, tick. Manipulation of data, tick, we've stopped that. Restricting access to endpoints, great, we've stopped that. And impersonation of endpoints, great, we've stopped that as well. Even if mutual TLS is painful in your context, there are some situations where it's still worth doing. For example, in this situation here, I wouldn't necessarily require mutual TLS for my client devices, because client devices, we use a different means of authentication. Effectively, we have the user bring their identity to establish trust. We don't need client-side certificates here. But if I was talking to, say, an external trusted party over the public internet, where I've got my service talking to their service, we might establish a mutual TLS then in that situation, potentially using some kind of bastion host maybe. But anyway, in that situation, even if it was painful, it still might be worth doing if I'm in these situations. But you can limit where your usage into those areas where you're sending maybe very sensitive data. But of course, if you can automate it, again, it makes perfect sense to establish within your perimeter. Now, of course, this is great what I've talked about so far, but I've talked about HTTP. What if you're picking other protocols? Well, actually, if you're running over to HTTP, even so, a lot of RPC now runs over HTTP. If you think about something like gRPC, now, of course, if you are picking some kind of synchronous protocol that doesn't use HTTP as underlying transport, you're just going to have to look up what the equivalent is for your technology stack of choice. Although gRPC is very widely used now as an RPC alternative. And that works on top of HTTP 2. Of course, many people do communication in an asynchronous fashion, perhaps via a message broker like Kafka or Rabbit. In those situations, look up and understand what those message broker technologies provide in this area. Both Rabbit and Kafka have very robust support for protecting your data in transit, and even doing things like role-based access controls for topics, making sure that only certain services can see certain topics and those sorts of things. So do take a look at the documentation for that. I think if you want to implement things like TLS on Rabbit, you have to install a couple of modules, but I don't think it's a lot of work if you're already managing your own Rabbit clusters. So that's great. So far what we've talked about is sort of almost transport authentication in a way. We've clarified client-side identity being the server talking to another server. So with server-side identity, the user service is who we think the user service is, and the music web shop is who the music web shop claims to be. And so we effectively have got at this point service-to-service authentication. So authentication is who are you, right? Of course, the more pressing issue is human beings in this system, because this is where things get a bit confused and confusing, especially when we operate in a world where with services, we might have other services calling other services. And then who's calling what on behalf of whom becomes kind of interesting. But let's take a look through this. So the first things first, how we handle user authentication, human being authentication, primarily doesn't actually change that much. I think many of you are probably already doing this using some kind of authentication gateway, where requests that come in from upstream clients, if they're not authenticated, they get redirected via some authentication flow to make sure they're logged in. And once they're logged in, you've got the requests that come in will have some kind of identifier so that we know those requests are coming from user devices that have been authenticated. And we put that inside some sort of gateway. And that means from your perimeter point of view, your services can kind of assume at that point that the human beings have already been asked to authenticate themselves. But of course, as we know, authentication is only half of it. We also have to think about authorization. Okay, so authentication is you are who you say you are. Authorization is what are you actually allowed to do. Just walking through a very common flow, Bob comes along and says, "Hi, I'm Bob. Can I access my profile page?" The auth gateway doesn't even let Bob see that. It just redirects him automatically and say, "Look, I need to log in before I'm going to let those requests go to anything else." Bob provides his credentials. He says, "Yes, I am Bob. Here's all my details." So he logs in, and then the call gets redirected to the music web shop, which renders a lovely page with all of Bob's details in, and Bob's happy. Now, of course, in a microservice environment, a microservice architecture, the music web shop may not actually be doing all the work. What the music web shop might actually be doing is actually delegating to other services the request to get the information it needs. For example, in this situation here, what I'm trying to do is render my profile page. I want to see Bob's profile page. So I make that call. The auth gateway lets that call go through because Bob has been logged in. The music web shop says, well, hang on a minute, I'm going to render a page for you, and that's great, but the user information that needs to go in that page is actually, that's in a different service. That's a downstream service. So I'm going to make a call downstream to the user service. The user service, can I have Bob's details? Now, at this point, we can assume we may be doing something like mutual TLS or some sort of HBAC-based OR scheme, but the user service has established a degree of trust with the music web shop. And so at this point, the user service can say, yes, I know this request has come from a known client. That client is the music web shop. And at this point, we're implementing what we call effectively implicit trust, where once I've identified who the music web shop is, I said, yes, they really are a service. Of course, I'm going to trust a request coming from you because you wouldn't ask me to do anything that I shouldn't do. And so the user service, gets Bob's details, loads them up out of its database, and sends them back in the response to the music web shop. The music web shop takes Bob's details, puts it into a nice HTML page, renders that, and sends that back up to the client device. Now, at the moment, nothing's gone wrong. Bob has asked for Bob's information. Bob is allowed to see Bob's information. So Bob sees Bob's information. The world's a happy place. But Bob is always up to no good. And he starts thinking, he says, well, look, that's my username there in the URL. So what happens if I just change the name Bob to the name Alice? So, of course, the auth gateway at this point just lets the request go through because I'm logged in. So, of course, off you go. I go to the music web shop and say, can I have Alice's details? The music web shop says, I don't handle user details. I'm going to go and fetch the information I need from the user service. So the call goes into the user service and says, can I have Alice's details? The user service says, well, you're the music web shop. I trust you. So here's Alice's details for you. And Alice's details are passed back up to the client device. And now we sort of have a problem because it doesn't really, in this, we assume that Bob should only be able to see Bob's details, but no one has actually validated if what Bob is allowed to see and enforced that. We have no authorization. It's arguable, but what we've effectively got here is what's called the confused deputy problem. And the confused deputy problem occurs when basically you trick an intermediate party into making requests it shouldn't ask. So the music web shop and the user service together have implicit trust. The user service trusts the music web shop when it makes requests. And we've got the music web shop to make a request on our behalf. And that's kind of the problem here. So one option is to apply some kind of authorization upstream. And so that we would validate that, okay, Bob is asking for Alice's information. So something upstream, it could be our auth gateway, it could be the music web shop, would say, well, hang on, I'm not going to let that happen because you shouldn't be able to see Alice's details. You should only be able to see your own detail. The problem with this is it's hard to know how to map a request coming in with the capabilities that request is asking for. What I mean by this is the user service is who handles all the functionality associated with user information. But we're expecting upstream services to know what a downstream service provides and provide authorization controls. So so upstream stuff has to have all the smarts about what users are allowed to do, but the capabilities it's trying to control access to are actually implemented in downstream services. This feels a bit weird to me. A big part of microservice architecture is trying to create these independently deployable services that sort of encapsulate all their functionality so we can deploy things quickly. But now, whenever I deploy a new capability in a service, I've also got to reconfigure something upstream to handle authentication, authorization. It doesn't feel right. It would be much better if the service that is being asked to do something is able to make its own choice about whether or not it allows that to happen. But for that to happen, effectively for us to do authorization downstream, the downstream service needs context of who made the request. And at the moment, that context is being lost. What we want to happen is when Bob asks for Alice's details, the music web shop passes that call on. The user service says, no, you can't, because I know you're Bob. But for that to work, the user service needs to know who Bob is. This is actually where people start using JOT tokens. So with a JOT token, you can take a JSON payload like this and basically encrypt it into use a cryptographic hash to come up with a sort of hashed form of that JSON payload. Looks like this. The first line is the header. Then there's the body, is that purple bit, and the bit at the bottom there is the signature. And so you basically take this information and you basically encrypt it. Pardon me. And this could then be passed as a header downstream. And people can't look inside this unless they've got the appropriate keys. And so you can send this information even over HTTP if you wanted to, although no, we shouldn't do that because you still are vulnerable to things like state theft here. So the way this would work would be Bob logs in, and when they log in, they may be using, say, a cookie to represent the fact they're logged in, or an IAuth token. The auth gateway says, okay, great, Bob, you were logged in, so I'm going to allow this request to go on to count the music web shop. And so what the auth gateway would typically do here is it would generate a matching JOT token for the scope of this request. And so this allows you to put sort of information inside that JOT token that you may not want to allow your client device to have access to. And it also allows you to limit the scope of this JOT token. So it could be really simple. So in this example here, it might just be a JOT token that says the user is Bob. And so that's in the header. And that header gets passed on to the music web shop. The music web shop just passes that along to the user service. The user service gets this sort of encrypted JOT token. It has the ability to validate that this is a valid token and decrypt it and actually look at the values. And it can do that all out of band because, that's sort of how all Magic API key stuff works. Isn't that lovely? No additional round trips required to look at the payload. So it says, actually, that's weird because you're making the request for Alice, but you're Bob. And my logic in the user service says you should only be able to ask for data when it's your data. And so, no, you can't do that. So key thing is the token's validated in the user service, so we know it's not been faked. It doesn't need an additional round trip. And you could, of course, put additional information into these JOT tokens. You could put things like groups in there as well. So maybe your logic says you can only access your information unless you're in the admin group. Just like you can with cookies, you can have time to lives for these JOT tokens as well. And if these are only request scope, those time to lives could be really quite short. It could be like a minute or two. You still need to be careful that if these JOT tokens if someone gets hold of a JOT token, they might be able to do things with it. Although if you're only issuing JOT tokens within your perimeter, that limits the value of that. Whereas if you're leaking JOT tokens out to client devices, you sort of expose yourself potentially to some of the same sorts of problems that occur when people send cookies over sort of just plain old HTTP. We're running a little bit late on time because I'm rambling, but I wanted to very quickly before we finish talk briefly about things called service meshes. And you may have heard of things with service meshes like Linkerd and Istio. And these are potentially a new type of middleware for microservice architectures that could solve a bunch of the common security concerns that we have. And I mean, they were developed effectively as middleware for synchronous service-to-service communication to handle common concerns like tracing, service balancing and service discovery, authorization, authentication, connection, resilience, and retry. And so that was, and so part of what they can solve is things like managing mutual TLS. The way they work in practice is kind of quite interesting. It depends. There's different deployment models. I mean, I'm actually outlining kind of an old school deployment model. Here's sort of how Linkerd version 1 works. But the way you can think of it is conceptually, you've got all the instances of your service running on a machine. And whenever they want to talk to another machine, they go via the service mesh. So this is the proxy model. This is how Linkerd version 1 worked. And that proxy can actually mediate all communication between services. So it can do things like it could validate JOT tokens. It could handle mutual TLS termination and those sorts of things on your behalf. And then you have like a control plane on top. So you get funding. To get funding, create a proxy and then have a thing called a control plane, and you'll get loads of funding from a VC firm. Is that great? And so different deployment models out there. Most of the world is now drifting towards what some people call the sidecar model. And this is sort of where things like Linkerd version 2, which used to be called Conduit, and Istio are now working. So if you think about it, it's middleware for synchronous communication. It handles a bunch of common concerns. So you can handle things like load balancing, traffic routing. So it's good for canaries. Actually, it's really useful for canaries. Traffic, the load balancing is kind of interesting because of where it sits in the networking stack. It can handle load balancing of HTTP2 in different interesting ways, which makes sense for things like gRPC. Service discovery. And again, different types of service discovery, like I can give you an instance on the same machine as you, tracing, and in our case, security. So things like mutual TLS. Now, I would say is that the service mesh world, I think the concept of service meshes is fantastic. I would say, although we've got mature service meshes out there, they're mature in the sense that that we have a 1.0 of Kubernetes, but where people are still iterating some of the core concepts. And so I think in the same way that we had a 1.0 of Kubernetes, but Kubernetes kept coming up with new abstractions that we worked with that you had to keep on top of, I think we'll still be seeing the same things as tools like as things like Istio bed down. I'd also say that there's a lot of competition in this space. I think the idea is great. I don't think Istio is necessarily the clear winner. There's also some grey areas here. You're thinking about tools like, Ambassador or Kong, which you usually see more as a north-south gateway. There's no reason why they can't also be used of east-west in a service mesh context. So my general advice to teams has been, if you're interested in a service mesh, maybe wait 6 months. Just let things stabilize a bit. If you really, really, really want one, sure, go for it now. But just bear in mind, you might want to change your mind in the year and pick a different implementation. I've been giving the advice to people to wait 6 months for a service mesh for the last 2.5 years, by the way. So it's taking a while for this whole area to stabilize. We've gone through a lot. So just to summarize, we've talked briefly about patching and passwords. This is basic stuff, but it's easy to get right and easy to get wrong as well. And these things could be especially problematic in microservice architectures because there are so many different places to handle these secrets. This is where you might want to think about something like a secret store. We talked about different types of transport security and how we think about authorization in those contexts. And finally, we looked at service meshes. I do have some other information on security stuff on my website. I've got like a 3-hour tutorial that goes into a lot more detail on this that's available. You can find out information on my website. And I've also got recordings of other videos that are all freely available over on my website as well. So thank you very much for listening. Now we are going to have time and I'll cut over to some questions that I hope have been coming in on Slack.
Yes, there are some questions. We do not have a lot of time because, well, we want to bind this into an hour. But one of the questions that came in was, you're mentioning patch management and dependency strategies. And a question that came in is, what's your vetting process for including a new dependency into a project initially?
Part of this comes down to your threat model. I've been in some organizations, for example, that are extremely conservative, where to even be able to add a new new open source library to your Maven file, you'd have to get a central team to sign it off. And so a lot of organizations actually enforce that based on what dependencies are allowed from that point of view. To be honest with you, I tend to go to trusted sources. Is it a mature project? Is it an actively maintained project? Most organizations I've worked in, they tend to allow developers to include stuff, and then they'll have a security person check it every now and then. But I think it's for each organization to come up with its own its own sort of happiness level. Different organizations have different tolerances for this kind of stuff. But my own checklist is the project something that seems to be actively maintained? Are people actively closing tickets? Is there a history of new releases coming out? Is there a history of tickets being closed? And then it's good enough for me normally.
Do you normally scan on your local machine for vulnerabilities in a dependency that you want to include in your system?
Well, normally what I'd be looking for is, I normally use something like SNCC or the equivalent on my system. And so I'm hoping that those tools are being picked up as part of those vulnerability detection tools. And so I'll typically be offloading that to somebody else. I mean, obviously, when you first include those libraries, you typically end up getting the latest release anyway, which sort of helps. So you're typically not picking up something that's 5 years old. You're going to get the latest point release, right? But at that point, I'd be hoping that SNCC is going to pick that up for me going forward.
And what's your view on how do you manage dependencies that were once added but are obsolete because, well, features are not there anymore or are not used anymore, and people end up with big, for instance, POM files with dependencies that are, not useful anymore?
Well, I mean, you could pick a language that has tree shaking, which would solve that problem for you, right? There are some modern computer programs out there that will actually remove code you don't use, but we don't all have access to those coding systems. A lot of this is about, I mean, there is something to be said for if the functionality isn't being used, removing it. A lot of people do monitoring of features that they ship to say, are people happy with this feature? I think more teams need to actively say no one is using this feature and delete it. And then get rid of those things. I think also if you start seeing vulnerabilities coming up on libraries and there aren't fixes are not coming in or it's taking you too long, you may need to rewrite parts of your system to port that functionality. The YAML parser, it's always a YAML parser. The YAML parser you're using is rubbish. No one's updating it. Okay, well, get a new YAML parser. The key thing, of course, is you don't even have the ability to prioritize that work if you don't know it's a problem. And you're not going to know it's a problem unless you've got something that's scanning it for you.
All right. These were the questions that were from the live session. So I will hand you over to Sam.
Cool. Thank you so much, both Brian and Sam. Sam, that session was amazing. I know we ran a bit over, but I hope that everyone watching enjoyed it as much as I did and found it useful. So thank you very, very much.
Cool. Thanks for having me, guys.
No, and obviously I hope it's not the last time that we have you on the Secure Developer. So for anyone watching that potentially wants to re-watch the session, as I said, once we stop live streaming, it'll go onto thesecuredeveloper.com. If you just click on past sessions, you'll be able to find all our past sessions as well as links to the podcast that's been going for a couple of years with some great interviews there. Please share and get involved. And as I said, if you've got anything that you'd like to hear on, reach out to me on Slack or the website, and we can look to put those sessions on in the future. Our next session is in 2 weeks, and it's going to be Guy Pajani from SNCC, and he'll be talking about the 3 phases of the DevSecOps. So please join us for that. You can find all the information and sign up on the website. But that's it for now. Again, thank you so much, Sam and Brian, for getting involved. I hope everyone has a lovely day, evening, lunchtime, wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.